If a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, "Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, "Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents." His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." But his master replied, "You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." May God bless to our hearing and understanding the portions of the scriptures which have been read today. Last week I told you that chapters 24 and 25 in Matthew are a second Sermon on the Mount delivered by Jesus in this gospel. The more familiar Sermon on the Mount for us is delivered early in the gospel on a mount overlooking the Sea of Galilee. It was a series of teachings, including the Beatitudes, about how to live life faithfully as a Christian. The second Sermon on the Mount is delivered to the disciples, this inner group. It's delivered on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem near the end of the life of Jesus. And its topic is the end of time and how to prepare, how to live faithfully in preparation for it. After starting out with a sermon in which he warns the disciples that there will always be people who are claiming that this war, or that hurricane, or that earthquake, or that astrological event is going to be the sign that the world is about to come to a close, they should not be led astray by those teachings, because no one knows when it will come. And he exhorts them to stay awake and alert and prepared. And he tells them 4 parables about preparation. These parables need to be seen as a group, really, to see the different facets of preparation which Jesus calls for, rather than seeing any one of them in isolation as the whole of what it means to be ready. The first one tells of a man who is leaving on a long journey and leaves one of his slaves in charge. The slave is supposed to be responsible for the welfare of all of the people in the master's household. Jesus says that the one is blessed who is found doing his duty when the master comes back. He's taking care of the people in the household. But, he says, if the slave begins to take advantage of his newfound authority and starts beating and oppressing the other slaves and hanging out with drunkards, then the master will return at an unexpected hour, and the slave who is left in charge will be in big trouble. The second parable is the one we looked at in depth last week about the wise and foolish bridesmaids. The wise bridesmaids are the ones who bring an extra flask of oil with them just in case the groom is delayed and the wedding is delayed late into the night, so that they'll be able to discharge their duties of escorting the groom in brilliant light to the bride's house with lamps burning brightly. We talked about the extra oil representing a reserve of faith, which is built up by an active life of faith, worship, study, prayer, mission, and fellowship. And it's that kind of life, that kind of preparation that can help us persevere in faith when 2,000 years go by and Jesus still hasn't come back. It's not a problem because we continue to grow and to be active in our faith, and our oil is constantly replenished rather than being burned out and used up. The third parable in the group is the one I just read, commonly known as the parable of the talents. It is frequently used for teaching about the stewardship of money, and rightly so, because it is indeed a story about the stewardship of money. It is also frequently used for teaching about the stewardship of talents, because of the use of the word talents in the story. It's somewhat misleading, though, because the word talent here is a sum of money in biblical times rather than the actual talents that we might have. But it's not only appropriate to use this story in talking about talents, it is appropriate to use it in talking about the stewardship of our whole lives and faith. To set the parable in context, having just told a parable about the importance of always having some extra oil on hand to sustain you through dark nights and long periods of waiting, Jesus moves on then to tell another parable showing that he doesn't mean that the life of faith is just protectively sitting on what you have and making sure it's always there. You've got to do something with what you have been given. You have to use it to make a difference in the world. Let's look at the story. There's a master again who's going on a long journey. Of course, Jesus is getting ready to leave them. He's getting ready to be taken from them, and it's uncertain when he will be back. In the parable, before leaving, the master calls aside 3 of his slaves and hands over sums of money for them to look after. Jesus says that the master gives to each of them according to their ability, which we'll return to shortly. To the first one, he gives 5 talents, to the second 2 talents, and to the third 1 talent. And he gives absolutely no instructions about what they're supposed to do with this money. So Jesus is not a micromanager. He's not a helicopter parent. It's up to each one of them what they're going to do with what has been entrusted to them. And I need to tell you at this point that we're talking about big money. 1 talent was the equivalent of about 20 years of wages for an ordinary working person. So if we were to conservatively say that an average salary today was $20,000 a year, then that would mean the servant given just the 1 talent was given the equivalent of $400,000, and the one with 5 talents was given $2 million. That would make me pretty nervous, and I doubt slaves at that time were used to handling that kind of money. Well, the servant with 5 talents didn't sit around worrying about it. He went right out and put it to work, began trading in the marketplace, and in time doubled what he had been given. The servant with 2 talents did exactly the same thing. The servant with the 1 talent went out and dug a hole in the ground and hid the money so that none of it would be missing when the master returned. And having just heard the story about the wise and foolish bridesmaids, the wise ones hanging on to their flask of oil and being unwilling to share any with the others, we might be thinking that this last servant had the right idea. If an emergency comes along, he'll be prepared. He's not going to spend it, and he's not going to risk a bad investment or having the master return during a month when the Dow is way down. By the way, remember that nobody had a lock on their door back then. There were no banks with vaults. There was no FDIC insurance. So burying money in a secluded spot was a rather common way of protecting one's money back then. After a long period of time, the master comes back. And of course, he comes to check in with his slaves about the money he left with them. The first and second both hand over their doubled amount, and the master exclaims to them, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a few things. I will now be putting you over much, and I invite you to enter into the joy of the master." The third servant steps forward and immediately starts with excuses. He even blames his master for his actions. He says, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not winnow. So I was afraid. I went and hid your talent in the ground. And here it is, every single cent of it, present and accounted for." The master explodes. "You thought you knew me, did you? You wicked and slothful servant. You should have at least invested it with the bankers so it would make some interest. Take the talent away from him, give it to the servant who has 10, and cast this servant into the darkness." As I said at the beginning, I think the key to this parable turns on how the servants view their master. The first two servants, it seems to me, had observed the master closely enough to know him, to know his practices, to know what he would do with that money himself if he had it, and to know how he would regard their different uses of the money. They've lived with him closely enough and watched him and learned from him, so they know what to do when he does this. They go out immediately and get to work and do what he would have done. What do? You pour yourself into life. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but as the old saying goes, you don't leave anything in the locker room. You give it everything you have. These two servants knew the master as a trusting and generous man, and they believed that the results of their actions would be pleasing in his sight regardless of the bottom line. The third servant, though, is afraid of the master. In his view, the master is a hard man. I wonder if that could be because he had always been a little on the lazy side and tried to get away with doing as little as possible, staying as far away from the master as he possibly could, hoping to not be noticed, and therefore incurring judgment previously. Tom Long says that the one-talent man pronounces his own judgment. He gets only the master that his tiny and warped vision can see. He says the story is not about a generous master who suddenly in the story turns cruel and punitive. It's about living with the consequences of one's own faith. If one trusts in the goodness of God, one can boldly venture out with eyes wide open to the grace in life and can discover the joy of God's providence everywhere. So is the parable about money or talents? Yes, but it's not entirely about that. It's about how we're supposed to live our lives during this time when we're waiting for the Master, Jesus, to return. When Jesus comes back, he's not going to the bank to audit our bank accounts. He's going to want to know how we invested our lives and what return there has been on that investment. I sort of wish Jesus had told this parable differently in one regard. I wish that one of the ones who had invested the money had lost everything, because I'd like to know how the master would have responded to that. It's my belief that if the master saw that the person had acted faithfully according to what he had learned from him, there would have been no condemnation. John Buchanan writes, "The point here is not really about doubling your money and accumulating wealth. It is about living. It is about investing. It is about taking risk. It's about Jesus himself and what he has done and what is about to happen to him. Mostly it is about what he hopes and expects from the disciples, from us, after he is gone. It's about being a follower of Jesus and what it means to be faithful to him. And the greatest risk of all, it turns out, is to not risk anything, not to care deeply and profoundly enough about anything to invest deeply, to give your heart away, and in the process, risk everything. The greatest risk of all, it turns out, is to play it safe, to live cautiously and prudently. And this is really made abundantly clear when we come to the fourth and last parable. It's the parable about the separation of the sheep and goats in the final judgment. And you'll remember that the criteria for this judgment is whether or not you fed the hungry, clothed the naked, visited the prisoner, gave water to the thirsty. Each and every one of those is a risky investment. Not a one of those will add 1 cent to the plus side of your financial ledger. But in the eyes of the master, the one who truly matters, each such investment is doubled. Inasmuch, he said, as you did it for one of the least of these, my brethren, you've also done it for me. So what do these 4 parables show us about how to live our lives in preparation for the second coming? First, we're to make sure that the people in our household and the people in our household of faith are safe and taken care of. Secondly, we need to practice our faith daily in such ways that the oil of faith is replenished rather than burning out. Thirdly, we're to take all the gifts that are given to us and invest them in the world in the way that we have learned from observing and reading about Jesus. And last, we are to be attentive to the needs of the least of those around us. That's what it means to live in the light. A story is told about a man named John Ruskin who lived long ago in the days when English villages were lit by oil lamps that lined the street. One evening, he and a friend were watching as a lamplighter moved down the street, lighting the lamps one by one. And Ruskin turned to his friend and said, "That's what it means to be a real Christian, because you can trace his route through life by the lights that he leaves burning." In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.